Isaiah, the Fifth Gospel, Chapter 3. Who wrote the book of Isaiah? There are some scholars that believe Isaiah wrote the book himself, or that he at least oversaw it being compiled and edited. If you start with that conclusion, you will have to acknowledge that Isaiah, in its present form, is an anthology, and that its contents have been grouped by theme rather than chronologically. While this hypothesis is possible, it is not the only possibility. Scholars note that there are 3 or 4 distinct sections of the book which each have their own particular focus. For example, chapter 1, verse 39 focuses on the threat the Assyrians and Babylonians pose for Judah. It also stresses how the spiritual corruption of God's people leaves them open and vulnerable to those threats. And though Isaiah predicts the coming of the Babylonian exile, he also provides a word of hope that God will use this calamity to redeem and purify his people. This part of the book is often referred to as First Isaiah. Chapters 40 through 55, which is sometimes called Second Isaiah, looks back from a time after the exile was over to show how God kept his promises to preserve his people through the ordeal so that they could continue to be his chosen people. It was Jewish scholars in the 11th century and Christian scholars in the 19th century who first began to question whether or not it was possible for an 8th century prophet to speak with clarity and accuracy about the events that would happen 2 centuries later in the 6th century BCE. Since the answer to that question relies on philosophical and theological presumptions, I will leave that question for you to decide. I will simply point out that 2nd Isaiah is quite different from 1st Isaiah. Chapters 56 through 66 make up a unit that is sometimes called 3rd Isaiah. This section focuses on how the God of history will continue to work on purifying and perfecting his people so that they can be instrumental in bringing about God's renewed creation. A very small minority of scholars believe that chapters 24 through 27 make up a distinct collection which is sometimes called the Little Apocalypse. Most scholars think that these chapters are proto-apocalyptic in nature and that they give us some clues about the development of later apocalyptic literature. So what does all of this mean for preaching or teaching? In preaching, I never use the terms 1st, 2nd, or 3rd Isaiah. The first reason is because Isaiah in its current form has a cohesive message. The second reason is because there's simply not enough time in preaching to explain what I mean by these terms. In teaching, I would probably use them to explain how these terms help us to think about the stages of development that Isaiah may have gone through as it came together in its current form. My conclusions about these separate works can be stated as follows. All material in Isaiah goes back to Isaiah, either directly or indirectly. Isaiah did not sit down and write chapter 1 and then sit down and write chapter 2, so on and so forth till he got to chapter 66. He did not, in other words, put this book together in its current form. Isaiah was a highly literate person, but it is unlikely that at the beginning of his ministry he had in mind the final form of Isaiah as it exists in our Bibles. Isaiah was a part of a family of prophets, and he had students and disciples around him who were committed to Isaiah's prophetic ministry. These students likely assisted Isaiah in collecting Isaiah's works and compiling them. The question is, when we read the book of Isaiah, how do we know when we are reading Isaiah's words and when we are reading the words of his disciples? Their words were intended to clarify, introduce, even expand upon Isaiah's work. We see the same thing in the Gospels. Those who wrote and compiled them found a need to introduce the stories and sayings of Jesus. Sometimes this took the form of defining a word or explaining a Jewish custom or talking about a geographical location that may not have been familiar to the reader. Sometimes their words explained one of Jesus' actions or teachings, or showed the reader how they were supposed to apply them to their own lives. I believe something similar is happening in the book of Isaiah. Here are some hypotheses about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. 1. They may simply be the result of those who compiled the book putting similar works with similar themes together. We see this kind of thing in anthologies, both ancient and modern. However, even though each of the 3 collections have their own emphasis, the themes of each will not be missing from any of the sections. So, for example, though 1st Isaiah focuses on the coming collision between Judah and the Assyrian empires, it still contains passages about what God will do after the exile and how God will renew the whole world through his people. Second, the 3 sections may represent 3 successive stages of editing and compiling. Isaiah's followers may have begun to pull his work together in the years leading up to the exile. Later followers, living after the exile, may have taken up the task of sorting through and compiling the work. A still later group may have added editorial remarks and adaptations in the form of updating the language, expanding upon it, and making it clear to future audiences. A third possibility is that the followers of Isaiah, including some of his offspring, may have expanded upon the work of Isaiah. They may have been authorized by Isaiah to continue to build upon his work. Ultimately, I will leave each of you to decide on which hypothesis you find most compelling.